She thought she was in control. She thought she was just doing her job. But one decision, one moment of assumption changed everything. Officer Linda Carson had no idea that a routine traffic stop would unravel her world. It was a quiet night, the kind of shift she preferred. The streets of Columbus were nearly empty. Just past 10 p.m., she sat in her cruiser, parked near an empty lot, watching cars roll by. Nothing out of the ordinary until she saw it. A sleek black sedan glided through the intersection. One of those expensive cars that belonged in a CEO's driveway. Nothing about it seemed unusual. Except for one small thing: no turn signal. Technically, it was a violation. A minor one, sure, but a reason to stop the driver. And maybe, just maybe, Linda felt like reminding people that rules were rules. She flicked on her lights. The sedan slowed, brake lights glowing red before it smoothly pulled over. Linda took her time stepping out, one hand on her belt, the other adjusting her radio. The street was quiet, just the hum of distant traffic and streetlights buzzing above. As she approached the driver's side, the window rolled down slowly, deliberately, and there he was, a black man, mid-40s, neatly trimmed beard, tailored navy suit. He looked expensive. He looked like he belonged in that car. His hands rested calmly on the wheel, fingers barely twitching. When his eyes met hers, Linda felt something tighten in her chest. She didn't like the way he looked at her. Not nervous, not apologetic, just waiting. License and registration. Her voice came out firmer than necessary. The man blinked once, then reached toward his glove compartment. Slow, controlled, like he already knew what she was thinking. "May I ask why I'm being stopped, officer?" His voice was smooth, even. Linda crossed her arms. Failed to signal a turn back there. A pause, a quiet breath. Something about his tone, it wasn't disrespectful, wasn't aggressive. But it was challenging, and Linda didn't like it. "License and registration," she repeated. He handed them over without another word. No shaking hands, no frantic explanations. She glanced at the ID, barely reading the name before flipping it over. That calm, confident attitude had irked her. "You live around here?" she asked. The man exhaled through his nose, barely a sigh, but enough to feel like a statement. "I don't see how that's relevant." Linda's grip on his ID tightened. She had been on the force for over a decade. Long enough to know when someone wasn't taking her seriously. Long enough to know when someone thought they could get away with something. She straightened, stepped out of the vehicle. For the first time, his expression changed. His jaw set, his head tilting slightly. "Why? I asked you to step out." A muscle in his cheek twitched, but he didn't argue. He just sighed, unbuckled his seatbelt, and pushed the door open. Linda stepped back as he stood. He was taller than she expected, broad-shouldered. There was no tension in his stance, no aggression, but something in his presence made her pulse tick up a notch. Hands on the trunk, he exhaled through his nose again. A slow, deliberate breath before turning and placing his palms flat against the car's cool metal. Linda's heart pounded. She could feel the shift now. The shift in power. This was her moment. Her moment to remind him who was in charge. She reached forward, pressing a hand against his back, guiding him down just slightly. He stiffened, and that was when something inside her snapped. Before she even thought about it, before she even registered what she was doing, her palm struck his cheek. A sharp, stinging crack echoed in the empty street. The man's head jerked to the side. His body froze. Silence, thick, heavy. Linda's own breath hitched. For a second, the world stilled. Then slowly he turned his head back to her. His face unreadable, his jaw clenched once. Then, in the most controlled, deliberate movement, he reached into his jacket pocket. Linda's stomach twisted. He pulled out his ID, held it up. Nathaniel Grant. Her eyes flickered down, scanning the title beneath his name. Chief of Police, her superior. Linda's pulse roared in her ears. Her fingers went numb. She had just struck her boss. Nathaniel Grant watched her, just watched, but this was far from over. Actions have consequences. Linda's world unraveled in the days that followed. The silent stares, the internal affairs investigation, the suspension, but the worst part, the conversation that came after. Sitting across from Grant, her hands clammy against her thighs, she finally spoke the words that had haunted her since that night. "I assumed he was a threat." Grant's voice was quiet but firm. "And why?" Linda had no answer. But for the first time, she didn't look away from the question. Bias isn't always loud. It doesn't always come with slurs or open hatred. Sometimes it's quiet. It's a split-second decision, a feeling you don't question. The question isn't whether it exists. The question is, are you willing to face it? And if you are, what will you do about it? If this story made you think, share it. Let's have the conversations that actually matter. And don't forget to subscribe to Unfolded Tales Explained and hit the bell icon to never miss a story that challenges the way you see the world.